This video is done in cooperation with Skillshare. To claim your special deal, use the link in the video description below. An ATR 72-600 from Royal Air Maroc Express is on final approach into Al Hoceima Airport in Morocco. The crew is flying something called non-precision approach, and the weather is quite misty. As they get down to their minimum descent altitude, their minima, the captain doesn't see anything, but still decides to continue the descent below the minima. Now, what's about to happen is one of the most serious incidents, and indeed accidents, that I have ever read about. It's as close to a complete hull loss that you could ever come. This is a story about Royal Air Maroc Express Flight 439. Stay tuned. Royal Air Maroc Flight 439 was the third flight of the day for the crew. The crew was based in Casablanca on the ATR 72, and the roster for the day on the 9th of July 2018 was to do what we call a V-leg flight. This means that the crew start at their home base, which is Casablanca in this case. Then they were supposed to fly to Al Hoceima. From Al Hoceima, they're flying on to Tangier, make a quick turnaround in Tangier, fly back to Al Hoceima, and then back home to their home base in Casablanca again. These flights are all relatively short flights, and they're all domestically inside of Morocco. Royal Air Maroc Express is a wholly owned subsidiary to the flag carrier of Morocco, Royal Air Maroc, and the aircraft that is being flown is, like I mentioned before, an ATR 72-600. It's one of the older 600s in the fleet, and it's a high-winged turboprop aircraft. And the fact that it's high-winged is likely going to have a very high significance in this story. Now, in the cockpit on this day is a very experienced senior training captain for Royal Air Maroc. He is 61 years old, has 13,487 hours in total, but only 193 hours on the ATR 72. And that's because he has done the most of his experience on the 737NG, where he was flying for the flag carrier, Royal Air Maroc, earlier as a line training captain. Together with him in the cockpit is a much more junior first officer. He's 25 years old, he has 1,063 hours in total, and 815 of those hours is flown on the ATR 72. So he's basically done his whole career on this aircraft, where he started about a year earlier. There's also a cadet sitting on the jump seat. The reason that the cadet is there is just to observe the operation, because the cadet is part of the recruitment program for Royal Air Maroc Express. So the cadet is not qualified on the ATR 72 when this happens. On the planning stage, the pilots are looking at the weather, and they realize that at least in one of their destinations, Al Hoceima, the weather is a bit marginal. It's overcast clouds with a cloud layer of about 600 feet, and there is also a very high air humidity. You can see that on the weather report because the temperature was 23 degrees, and the dew point, which is the temperature when clouds start to form, was also 23 degrees. So this is indicative of some quite tricky conditions at Al Hoceima. Now, Al Hoceima as an airport is also a little bit tricky. It's surrounded on both the south and east and west side by terrain, which means that there's only an instrument arrival available from the north towards the south, runway 17. And because the terrain is fairly high on the sides, the minima for the non-precision approach is also set quite high. And that's because you need to be able to attain certain terrain clearance margins when you do the missed approach. So even though the approach in itself is flown completely over water, the minima is still quite high in order for them, in case of missed approach, to be able to get up above the terrain as quickly as possible. With all of this in mind, the line training captain sets out the plan for the day, and he says that I am going to be pilot flying for the first leg. That way I can show you how to fly this non-precision approach into Al Hoceima. And then for the second, third and fourth flight, the first officer is going to be pilot flying and the captain is going to be pilot monitoring instead. All said and done, the aircrafts taxis out as normal in Casablanca, it takes off and it climbs up to their cruising altitude of flight level 160, which is about 16,000 feet. Because remember, these are all domestic flights inside of Morocco and they're quite short, all of them. During their relatively short cruise phase on their way up towards Al Hoceima, the crew receives a system warning for the EGPWS system. That's the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System. And the warning basically says terrain fault. Okay? That's an indication that the system has gone into a slightly degraded mode. And the crew discusses this among themselves and realizes that it's probably because of a temporary lack of satellites, GPS satellites. And that can happen from time to time, right? If there's not enough satellites to give a good enough position for the aircraft to satisfy the EGPWS system, well then it's going to give this warning for as long as, there is a lack of satellites. And 6 minutes later, this warning disappears, which indicates that the system is now fully functional again. The crew doesn't discuss this much more. They continue towards Al Hoceima. They initiated their descent. Remember, the captain is pilot flying for this one. And they decide that they're going to fly a RNAV approach. Right? This is an approach that is a non-precision approach based on GPS coordinates on the way into Al Hoceima. The minimum for this particular approach is 1,030 feet. That's the lowest that you're allowed to fly without having a proper visual picture of the runway that you're about to fly into. Right? So as you reach 1,030 feet, you need to see the runway that you're about to land on in order to continue the approach. This is an issue because the cloud base is reported to be only 800 feet. The cloud base is the lower part of the clouds. Okay? So if you have a MDA, a minima, which is at 1,030 feet, and a cloud base that is at 800 feet, it means that you're likely inside of cloud as you reach your minima and you won't be able to see the runway as needed. All said and done, the crew elects to continue to start the approach anyway. They fly the approach reasonably stabilized, but when they get down to their MDA, their minima, they don't see anything. The captain cannot see the runway in front of him. Now the correct thing to do in this case is to initiate a go-around. Okay, because you don't legally have what it takes in order to continue the approach. But here is where things are starting to really become shady, because the captain now decides to continue the descent without visual references below the MDA. He initiates the descent in a vertical speed mode, means he's telling the aircraft to continue to descend at a set rate of 1,000 feet per minute. Now if you go in and have a look at the descent rate that you get from the approach plate, you can see that at around 120 knots that they're flying, they should be around 650, 700 feet per minute. So this means that the captain is now descending quicker than the actual approach path is. About a minute later, the EGPWS, the Ground Proximity Warning System, issues a hard warning. It says, terrain ahead, pull up.
Terrain ahead, pull up.
Now, this is extremely serious warning because this is the aircraft telling you that you are in a position where you're likely going to suffer a CFIT accident, a controlled flight into terrain accident. The only acceptable way to react to that warning is to do what we call a terrain escape maneuver. Okay? That is a maneuver where you just add full thrust, you pitch up, and you make sure that you maintain your current configuration. And this is basically just escaping, trying to get away from the terrain as quickly as possible, because that warning indicates that you don't really know where you are. Something has gone wrong in your navigation and you've ended up in a place where you are close to terrain where you shouldn't be. So this is the training we all receive. All pilots that are flying aircraft that are equipped with a GPWS system are trained to do this exact maneuver if they get this warning. But that's not what happens. Instead, the captain actually continues to descend. Disregarding this warning, he gets as low as 45 feet over the sea. Then he levels the aircraft off. He climbs up to a maximum altitude of 108 feet, that's about 33 meters over the sea, and continues flying at that altitude until he sees the runway and goes in to land. This is an outrageous disregard for established procedures and minimums. And you would ask yourself, what is the first officer doing in the middle of all this? Well, it turns out not much, right? There's not much calls coming from the first officer in this. It seems like the captain is basically flying this aircraft by himself and is getting very minimum support or suggestions from the first officer. Now, what he should have said was he should have initiated, do the terrain escape maneuver, or at least a go-around, something like that, because it's a flagrant disregard of procedures. But this did not happen. The aircraft lands from this approach, they taxi into the terminal, and just to give you an idea here, it's if you find yourself in a situation where you've had a hard GPWS warning, well then after you've initiated and done the terrain escape maneuver and then gone in and landed off that, you are actually required to stop the aircraft, pull the cockpit voice recorder circuit breaker to make sure that everything that led up to that incident is being saved, and then you call your company. And most likely you're going to be stood down. You're not going to be able to continue to fly after an incident like that, right? Because there needs to be an investigation. This doesn't happen. Instead, the crew makes their turnaround in Al Hoceima. They fly a very short flight over towards Tangier, and then after they've landed in Tangier, sitting on the apron there, then they start discussing what to do next time that they're coming into Al Hoceima. Okay? And what's about to happen now, guys, is many magnitudes worse than the first approach, believe it or not. So when they're sitting on the apron now in Tangier, the first officer is going to be pilot flying for this leg, and they decide to do a combined departure and approach briefing. Now this is fairly common. If you're doing really short flights, there's not enough time in flight to do a proper approach briefing. So what you do then is that you go through and discuss the approach briefing on the ground, and then you just do the small applicable parts, like making sure that the FMC is properly set up, the computer, and that the minimums are set when you're in flight, and then you just recap what you talked about on the ground. So this is perfectly normal. Now the captain says that on the next approach that we do into Al Hoceima, we're not going to do the RNAV approach that we did last time. Instead, we're going to do a VOR approach. Okay? This is still a non-precision approach. But this time it's flown not with references to GPS points, but with references to a ground-based VOR nav aid. The benefit of doing that is that the minima is a little bit lower. So the MDA on the VOR approach is 760 feet instead of 1,030 feet. And the thought here obviously is that they noticed already that the weather wasn't great at Al Hoceima, and they want to get as low down towards the airport as possible in order to see the runway. This makes perfect sense. But in this part of the briefing, the captain is also saying to the first officer that if you get down to 760 feet and we don't see anything, then I want you to continue to descend to 400 feet instead. We'll level off, and then we'll continue to fly at 400 feet until we reach the missed approach point, which is at 2 nautical miles prior to the VOR. If we haven't seen anything there, well then we will execute the missed approach. Once again, this is a flagrant disregard for the rules, right? The MDA is there for a reason. It's there to safeguard the flight in case of a missed approach. So why is the captain so keen on going lower? Well, we'll never really know that for sure, but the likelihood is that the captain knows that the approach is flown over water. So he doesn't see the danger in going below the MDA, the minima, because there's only water there anyway. And he's also done exactly that on the previous approach and managed to land off it. Okay, it's a little bit of get there-itis, when a flight crew is so focused on getting the aircraft to land at their destination that they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. Okay, all said and done, the first officer agrees that that we can do this, right? Which is a complete no-no, by the way. But also here, he comes with his own little suggestion. And he says that since they got that warning, the GPWS warning on the previous approach, maybe we should turn off the GPWS on this approach because that warning was a bit untimely. Obviously, that warning was untimely because they shouldn't have been where they were, right? They were 1.7 kilometers away from the runway at 45 feet. So this suggestion indicates a fundamental lack of understanding for what the system is doing. But there is also a possibility that he might have thought that the warnings were incorrect because of the earlier issues that they had with the EGPWS system on their flight over towards Al Hoceima on their first flight. We will never really know that. In any case, the captain takes up the minimum equipment list, which is a manual that we have where if we have a broken system on board the aircraft, we can verify in this manual whether or not we're allowed to fly with it or if we need engineering to fix it. Now this MEL, it's not supposed to be used for deciding which systems that we can turn off. It's supposed to be there in case something breaks and we want to know whether or not it's safe to fly with that system not functioning. Anyway, the captain decides by reading the MEL that it is perfectly legal to fly without it, so we can turn it off. So already here you can kind of see how the kind of holes in the Swiss cheese model is starting to line up, right? They're already briefing about how to disregard established rules and turning off systems that are there to save them, to help them, the kind of final warning systems that are there to avoid disasters. Now, before we continue and explain what happens on this second approach into Alocema, there are a couple of things that we need to discuss. First of all, a stabilized approach. Okay. Now, I have mentioned the importance of stabilized approaches in previous videos. Okay. Many other accidents have happened because the pilots have not been stabilized. Now, what we're trying to achieve with the stabilized approach is to give the pilots time to concentrate on the landing ahead. Okay? We don't want the aircraft to be in a position where a lot of maneuvering is needed, because it's much less likely that if we have to do a lot of maneuvering or a lot of configuration, for example, that we'll be able to get the aircraft safely down. Okay? So what the industry has said is that in most cases, you need to be stabilized either by 1,000 feet if you're inside cloud, or 500 feet if you're night shift visual. And by stabilized, we mean that you need to be on the right altitude, at the right position. You need to have the correct speed. You need the aircraft to be configured the way it should be configured, with gear down and the final flaps out. Okay? The thrust needs to be set at a final approach value, which is appropriate, with only minor changes to be done on all of these things. If that's the case, well, then you're stabilized and you can continue the approach for a safe landing. If you reach 1,000 feet in IMC, in the cloud, and you are lacking one of these, well, then it's much safer to go around, give yourself some more time, do a second approach, stabilize yourself earlier, and then come down and land. As always, when we're flying, it's all about safety. It's all about giving ourselves the margins needed to land the aircraft in a proper and safe way. Now, the second thing that I want to point out is how the crews are taught to fly a non-precision approach according to their flight crew training manual. So basically, what they're supposed to do and at what distance in order to be able to achieve a stabilized approach. And in the flight crew training manual for Royal Air Maroc Express, it says that prior to the final approach fix, that's the distance when they're supposed to initiate their final descent down towards the runway, 4 miles prior to that, they need to call for flaps 15. Followed quickly with gear down, flaps 30. Now the aircraft is basically completely configured for landing. Just prior to descent, they're supposed to set the missed approach altitude in their autopilot selector. As they fly over the FAF, they're supposed to initially initiate the descent rate with a slightly higher descent rate than what's indicated on the approach plate. That's because of the inertia of the aircraft. They get a little bit high, but pretty soon after that, they're supposed to level the aircraft out on a descent rate that's indicated from the plate. Okay. The pilot monitoring is supposed to give distances versus altitudes to give an indication to the pilot flying whether they're high or low, and the speed should be pretty much constant. At this point, they should also complete the landing checklist so that when they pass 1,000 feet above the landing aerodrome, they're completely stabilized with all of the approach checklist and the landing checklist complete, and they can now just focus to continue down to their MDA to decide either to continue in case they are visual, or if they don't see the runway, execute a go around. Now, this way of flying a non-precision approach is called, well, it has many names, but one of them is CANPA, Constant Angle Non-Precision Approach. It's also called a CDA, Constant Descent Approach, and many others. But the point here is that we fly these approaches just like we fly in ILS, with a constant descent down, and then if we don't see anything, we go around. Now, back in the old days, we used to do something called dive and drive, basically, which is where you fly over particular distances from the runway, and once you pass that, you can descend down to, for example, your MDA, and then you can level off and you can fly on the MDA with all of the gear and the flaps and everything hanging out in level flight until you reach the missed approach point. All right, this is how people used to fly the approaches back in the day. But it has been very clearly established that it's much safer to fly it the Campa way, the CDA way. Now, the only issue with flying it that way is that because you are constantly descending and not maintaining your altitude, there is a chance that you might shoot through your MDA, and that's not allowed, right? You cannot descend below your MDA. And the way that we have fixed this is that we've added either 30, 40 or 50 feet, depending on which aircraft you're flying and which company you're working for, to the minimum. So if we have an MDA of 760 feet, like in this case, well, in that case, we've set the minima to 800 feet. That gives us the margin. So when we get down to 800 feet, if we don't see anything, we'll press toga and we'll go around, and the aircraft will just descend slightly, never reaching the MDA of 760 feet. And we've flown the approach as safely and as accurately as possible. So I just wanted to give you that as a slight background. And after this short break, I will tell you what happened on this absolutely mind-boggling third approach. I also want to take a few seconds here to say a special thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, I know that you are watching this because you are a curious person, a lifelong learner, someone who constantly wants to improve and understand the world around you better. And in that case, Skillshare is definitely something that you should be checking out. Okay, they have thousands of high-quality video courses and pretty much anything that you can imagine. A course that I'm using myself at the moment is 5 Minutes Creativity with Jasmine Cheyenne, where she gives kind of hands-on tips on how to chisel out a few minutes to be creative every single day. And it's something that I personally really need. But there are also courses in, storytelling, creative photography, or even how to use your own home simulator to improve and prepare before you start your private pilot license. Something that I've been doing together with my oldest son, Lucas, and he really, really enjoys. Using Skillshare is really affordable. It's less than $10 per month, but the 1,000 first of you who uses this link in the description below will get a whopping 30% off the annual fee of Skillshare Premium. So you can support me by supporting them. Go down, click the link, and let me know what your favorite course is. I'd love to hear. Let's continue with the accident flights, the Royal Air Maroc Express flight 439, and what happened. So, the aircraft has now left Tangier, and it's at its cruising altitude of flight level 130, about 13,000 feet, proceeding up for a second approach into Al Hoceima. The crew has already pre-briefed that they will continue to descend below their minimum descent altitude if they don't see what they were required to see at their minimum. Okay. Now, as they get their initial descent clearance to 6,000 feet, the captain continues to brief the first officer about what to do in case of a missed approach. And he also adds kind of an ominous comment to the briefing where he says, "Don't worry, I will be monitoring the speed and the water." Now, why would he say that he was going to be monitoring the water? Well, that will become very obvious very soon. So the aircraft starts descending. As it descends past 4,500 feet, the captain reaches over and disconnects the EGPWS, the Ground Proximity Warning Systems, like they had briefed on the ground in Tangier. They continue to descend down to 3,000 feet. They get into contact with Al Hoceima Tower, and Al Hoceima Tower gives them the latest weather. The weather is runway 17 in use, winds are calm, visibility is 4,000 meters in mist, cloud base is overcast at 600 feet, temperature is 23 and the dew point is 23. The QNH, the air pressure, is 1016. Now this is really important information because it tells you a couple of things. First of all, the visibility is only 4,000 meters. The required to do the approach is 3,200 meters. So visibility is starting to be quite bad, and that's over the runway. This approach is being flown over the sea. And since the temperature and dew point are 23, it's very possible that the visibility over the sea is even worse. Okay? Something called sea fog can very quickly form during these conditions, especially when the wind is calm. The other thing, obviously, is that the cloud base is 600 feet, which is well below their minima. However, this crew doesn't seem to be too bothered about that because they've already decided that they are going to disregard their minima and fly lower anyway. As the aircraft continues to descend past 3,000 feet and then to 2,100 feet, the captain starts to tell the first officer to slow down. It's obvious here that he realizes that the aircraft is a little bit hot and high, a little bit high on profile and a little bit high on speed. So he asks the speed to be reduced from 220 knots back to 170 knots. As the aircraft levels off at 2,100 feet, it does so just prior to reaching the final approach fix. The aircraft goes into altitude hold, which means it goes into level flight, and it still has a quite high speed at this point. This is significant because if the aircraft passes the final approach fix in altitude hold, it means that it's going to become very quickly high on profile. The captain acknowledges that and tells the first officer to reset the MCP altitude. First officer reaches over and it sets 400 feet, just like they had been discussing on the ground earlier on. But remember, according to the correct profile that we talked about before, he should have been setting 3,000 feet, which was the missed approach altitude. And the reason that that's important is because in case you need to do a go-around, the aircraft needs to be set up to be able to capture the missed approach altitude, so you don't fly through that. But they set 400 feet, they initiated the descent. At 1,800 feet, they select flaps 15. And as they pass about 1,500 feet, they select gear down. Now, at this point, the captain is obviously very concerned about their altitude because he tells the first officer to continue, go to the limit. And the first officer responds to that by increasing the vertical speed to 1,800 feet per minute. If you look at the kind of vertical speed that they should be keeping at this point on the approach, they should be back at their approach speed, plus maybe 20 knots maximum. And that will give them a descent speed of about 650 to 700 feet per minute. They've now selected 1,800 feet per minute, which means that not only are they going to get onto the profile, they're going to go below the profile very, very quickly. And that is exactly what happens. When they pass the landing gate at 1,000 feet, remember, that's when they should be completely stabilized with all of their checklists completed. They are far from stabilized. They don't have their landing flaps. They're only at flap 15 at the moment. They're about 240 feet below their profile, and the speed is way too high. They have a speed of about 150 knots at that point. They should be at maximum about 125 knots. So the right thing to do at this point is to execute a go-around, right? The aircraft is not stabilized. They are running behind the aircraft. They should just go around and slow things down. But this is not what happens. At around 800 feet, they select flaps 30, which is the landing flap, and they complete the landing checklist. Very soon after that, the aircraft is still at 1,800 feet per minute vertical speed, so it goes into altitude star, which is the equivalent of altitude acquire in the Boeing, where the aircraft tries to pitch up in order to capture its selected altitude of 400 feet. So the aircraft starts pitching up, and when the first officer recognizes this, he resets the altitude once again. First down a little bit and then up to 9,400 feet, which doesn't make any kind of sense, but if you think of the kind of workloads that he would be under during this approach where nothing is done the way it's supposed to be done, it kind of makes sense. He just sets something higher. When they reach 400 feet, remember, that's when they're supposed to be maintaining 400 feet until distance 2, which is the missed approach point. The captain still doesn't see anything of the runway, and he says, keep going to 300. First officer, once again, inputs vertical speed, 1,800 feet per minute. This is at 400 feet. At 310 feet, the first officer is starting to indicate that he's not feeling very happy about this. The aircraft continues to descend with a very high descent rate, and at about 135 feet, he actually reduces the descent rate 1,400 feet per minute. And he also says this is not normal. And then in his mother tongue, Arabic, he also says, I'm taking it manual. He disconnects the autopilot, and at 80 feet over the sea, the first officer now starts to pitch up. He still hasn't said go around, but he's just gone manual, started to pitch up. And as soon as he's doing this, the captain reaches in and pushes forward. So now you have two pilots that are struggling with the controls. One is pulling back to climb, the other one is pushing forward. The captain turns out to be a little bit stronger than the first officer. The aircraft continues to descend. At 35 feet, the first officer adds go-around thrust, but it's too late. The aircraft continues to descend with about -3 degrees of attitude. It impacts the water with 3.2 Gs at about 1.4 nautical miles short of the runway. The aircraft bounces off the water. It's then descending into the water again, this time with a 3.9 G impact. And just to get you a little bit of a feeling of how strong of an impact that is, if we do a landing and we impact with more than 2.1 Gs, we need to call engineering to do a hard landing inspection. So these are very, very strong impacts with the sea. After the second impact, amazingly, the aircraft starts climbing away. That's because the captain has now released controls, probably from the shock of the impact. The first officer is still pulling back on the controls. And remember how in the beginning of the video I said that it was going to be important, the fact that the ATR 72 has a high wing structure? Well, it is likely that if this would have been a low wing aircraft, well then as the aircraft impacted the water, the engines would have also touched and it would have caught the aircraft to cartwheel over. And this would have been a completely different story. But because the aircraft now impacted the water with only its body and its landing gear, it could continue to climb away, which is what happened. But the captain still shows sign of being very confused at this point. We know this because in a normal go-around with the ATR 72, once the go-around is called for, you're supposed to go from your landing flap 30 to flaps 15, and then as you get positive rate, you can select the gear up. But what the captain actually does is as the aircraft starts climbing, he reaches over and he goes from flaps 30 all the way to flaps up. The aircraft is climbing very steeply now and at a very low speed, and this could have actually caused the aircraft to stall completely. But because it takes about 14 seconds for the flaps to be retracted from flaps 30 to flaps up, the first officer is actually pitching forward as this is happening, so the aircraft is continuing to accelerate and it doesn't go into stall, right? There's not even any mentioning in the final report about any stick shaker being activated. And I know this because it was highlighted by a different channel, which I wanted to check out, Fly with Magnar. He is an ATR captain that did a video on this incident as well. And if you want even more technical descriptions of this incident, then I suggest you check it out here. Anyway, as the aircraft is now climbing away, they call air traffic control and tells them that they have done a go-around and that they are diverting towards Nador. Air traffic control comes back, reads it back, and then asks them what the reason for the go-around is. This is something that they very often do. The captain goes onto the radio and says, well, we've had a bird strike. Bird strike. Anyway, they continue to fly to Nador. They do a normal descent, approach and landing in Nador. And when they get out and have a look at the aircraft after the landing, they realize that there is substantial damage to the aircraft. There is a big gaping hole in the part of the underbelly where the landing gear is situated. And the landing gear, both the main gear and the nose gear, have recorded well above structural limit loads. So this means that not only does the body need to be repaired, but also the landing gear needs to be completely replaced. But the main thing here, and the amazing thing, is that none of the 52 passengers, nor the cabin crew or the pilot, are injured, right? No one is injured in this incredible event. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is as close to a complete hull loss as you can possibly get without actually having a hull loss. It is incredible that everyone survived this event. Now, in the report, which the captain had to write after this, he initially insisted that it was a bird strike that caused the incident. But given the amount of damage to the aircraft, he would have had to impact the dragon from Lord of the Rings in order for that to happen. So he subsequently changed the report to tell the authorities that he's actually impacted the sea as part of the approach. Because of that, this is now a huge investigation, and the investigation came to some quite obvious conclusions. This accident was caused by non-compliance with operational procedures, specifically the disregard of the MDA, their minima, their continuing a completely unstabilized approach, their voluntarily shutdown of the ground proximity warning system, and the lack of effective CRM on the flight deck. This is an extremely strongly worded final report, as it should be. The recommendations that the final report came out with was for Royal Air Maroc to implement better CRM training that would emphasize the importance of speaking up when something is wrong and for correct decision making to happen on the flight deck. They also needed to check and verify and train the crew's understanding of how to fly a constant descent angle approach, the importance of adhering to minimas and to stabilized approaches. But all in all, this is a complete rebuke of how this crew manages to fly this approach and how they completely disregarded very well established safety norms and procedures. Now, the obvious question that I'm going to get is, what happened to the pilots? Did they get to keep their jobs? Were they fired? Were there any criminal investigations attached to this? And the honest answer to that is, I don't know. That's not the way that these final reports are built. They're not built to kind of give out, blame or tell airlines what to do with their pilots. They're only constructed to share knowledge with the rest of the flying population out there to avoid things like this from ever happening again. When it comes to what happened to the pilots, that is an internal procedure that goes on inside of the airlines, and I have no idea what happened to these guys. Now, if you want to ask me questions, so you want to come with suggestions about other incidents and accidents that I should be covering, then send it in either via the Mentour Aviation app or via my Discord server, or you can send it in to news@mentorpilot.com. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.